$3. That was all Silas Ward had left in his pocket when the auctioneer's voice tore through the morning like a rusty blade. Little did he know that those 3 crumpled coins would drag him into an unwanted battle. A battle against corruption, against the false laws that the town of Copper Falls had long since accepted. That morning, Silas had only intended to go into town to buy a roll of rope and some coffee. He was not a meddlesome man. 10 years of living alone on the barren land had taught him to keep his head down and his mouth shut. But then, in the middle of that noisy, red-dusted market, where men hawked livestock alongside rows of gold miners, something happened that shattered all the silence inside him. A crowd gathered in front of the old warehouse, jostling and shouting as if they were fighting over a prize stallion. But no, it was not a horse. It was not a cow. It was a little Chinese girl, hair matted with mud, huddled on a wooden crate like a voiceless commodity. The voice cried, $2, $2.50, $3. No one looked the child in the eye. They saw the skinny body as a tool, an asset, a liability that could be paid for. And worse, they thought it was normal. Silas knew he was witnessing a crime committed in public, well justified by silence and twisted laws. He was no hero, nor was he wise, but he understood one thing. Justice cannot exist if people remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. And so, with $3 and a moment of impulse, he stepped into a quagmire of prejudice, of hatred, of a town too accustomed to turning a blind eye to injustice. He never intended to change the world, but perhaps the world needed someone like him to start changing. Saturday mornings in Copper Falls always begin with the sound of horseshoes, the sound of horns, and the smell of red dust mixed with sweat. The town seems to wake from its weary slumber to enter market day, where everything has a price, the stark even things that shouldn't have one. Lazy cowboys lean in front of saloons, unkempt miners crowd around tool stands, and farm wives haggle for pennies on flour or patches of cloth. In this atmosphere, justice, if it ever existed, is buried deep under the dust of time. Starkey, Silas Ward rode into town as the sun crept over the horizon, wearing the tired look of a man who had lived too long in silence. His faded cloak, his old boots crusted with cracked earth, and his gaze like a dull knife. No one paid any attention to him. And that was the way he liked it. A lone man living on the edge of town, more than 10 miles of dirt roads where gunfire was more familiar than greeting. He had come for no great reason today, just to buy some new rope, a sack of coffee if the price was bearable. 2, in the habit of staying long in Copper Falls. He did not like drink. He did not like crowds. He hated the way men laughed and thought they owned the world because they had a gun and a bag of silver in their belts. But what disgusted him most was the indifference of the people here to wrongdoing. Years of quiet observation had shown him that this town lived by its own laws, the laws of the strong, the money, the white man. Justice here was not a scale, but a gun pointed at the most hated person. And little did he know, in just a few minutes, the rope he intended to buy would be replaced by a decision that could cut the fates of many people short, or tie them together forever. The auction took place next to an old warehouse that had once held corn and grain, but now smelled of mold and people. The crowd crowded around a wooden crate, eyes eager and voices excited, as if they were choosing a healthy horse or a new gun. But no, what was for sale today was a life. A small Chinese girl, her head bowed low, her hair matted with sweat and dust. Her eyes did not dare to look directly at anyone, but when they did, her gaze was like a silent scream. The auctioneer, fat and smelling of rancid fat, waved his arm as if pointing at a young calf. Opening bid is $2. Who's offering? $2.50? $3. No one asked her name. No one cared why she was standing there. To them, she was just an exotic commodity, something to be served, something to be commanded, something to be owned. Dare, the miners, the ranchers, the men who had once had the money and the power to bully others, were bidding like it was a weekend pastime. Silas stood at the back, still holding the reins. He did not intend to stop, did not intend to look, but then the girl's eyes flickered to him, just for a moment, like a plea from the depths of despair. And he saw, not a child, but a living indictment of the corruption of this place. Dare, $3.50. Rectangular. His voice rang out, low and decisive. The crowd fell silent. The auctioneer froze. One of the men, rich, red-faced at being outmaneuvered, started to protest. But Silas looked straight at him. His eyes said nothing, but they left no room for negotiation. And then the wooden hammer knocked on the rotten wooden crate. Sold! A Campania's ward, a recluse on the edge of town, has just bought back a man's dignity for $3.50, and at the same time declared war on a town that has grown accustomed to burying justice under dust and coins. Not everyone gets angry at wrongdoing. In Copper Falls, sometimes it's the kindness that gets the most hate. Immediately after the auction, when Silas Ward led the Chinese girl, Min, out of the old warehouse, the town became as heavy as a sandstorm. Curious glances turned to contempt, whispers became sharp as knives. In a place where skin color can determine fate, for a white man, even a lonely man, to publicly defend an Asian child was like poking at the anthill of prejudice. Garrett, the restaurant owner, was the first to draw the line. Not serving its kind, he said, hands on hips, eyes sweeping over Min like trash. If you need to feed it, go behind the Chen laundry. It smells more familiar there. Silas said nothing at first. He just stood there, his eyes dark as the sky before a storm. But as Min stepped back, his eyes full of shame, Silas stepped forward, his voice as deep as the rolling of stones. My money, my meal. This girl sits at the table with me. But then Core Jennings, the richest rancher in the area, appears with his son Blake, who has the eyes of a predator and the pride of someone who has never been denied anything. With them is Frank Morrison, who runs the mine with his fists instead of rules. Ty, what are you doing, Ward? Cord demanded, inhaling each word like an old cigarette. Make a fool of us? Buy something worth nothing and then act like it's our equal? Blake stepped forward, his hand on the butt of his gun, his eyes blazing. People like him, he said, pointing at Min, have a place. In the kitchen, in the cellar, somewhere dark, not sitting next to white men at the dinner table. Frank chuckled, but no one mistook his laugh for mirth. It was the laugh of one who takes injustice for granted and considers compassion the folly of men past their prime. Copper Falls has never been a place where justice is celebrated. It's a place where justice is laughed at without a gun and a badge. And now Silas stands alone before the town, not because he wants to be a hero, but because he can't ignore the evil that everyone else has come to accept as normal. Min said nothing all the way from Copper Falls. She sat huddled in the corner of the carriage, looking down at her feet, as if anyone spoke she would vanish into the dust. But Silas Ward said nothing. He knew that the silence was not out of stubbornness, but out of fear, a fear so ingrained it became like breathing. In a land where the law favors the strong, a girl like Min is little more than a commodity. She is silenced not because she cannot speak, but because she is so used to not being listened to. Silas didn't know what he was doing, but he knew what was unacceptable. He didn't buy Min. He took her away from people who believed they could decide lives with cash and a smirk. He had no plan, just a raw intuition. The right thing to do was the right thing to do, even if it meant turning the town against him. Stabilized did not leave the porch on her first day at the farm. While Silas cooked dinner, she sat away from the table, waiting to see if she would be called. When he placed a bowl of hot corn soup before her, she touched it with both hands, trembling as if she were holding a treasure. Just eat, he said, his voice as calm as if he had been doing it all his life. There weren't many words between them, but every little thing Silas did, leaving out the cornflakes, leaving the kitchen door unlocked, washing the dishes instead of telling her to, had begun to erode Min's fear like rainwater slowly erodes rock. One afternoon, as he was cutting firewood, Min stepped out onto the porch and spoke for the first time since leaving town. Her voice was as thin as smoke. Can I help? Not because he needed help, but because the statement was living proof that trust, when treated with genuine kindness, can grow even in the driest soil. He nodded, handing her the small cleaver. If you wish. Not a command, not a request, just an invitation. And from that day on, two people, one old, one young, one full of old wounds, one carrying new pain, began to rebuild something that both thought, they no longer deserved. Trust. And once again, justice, though not coming from the court, still found its way back through the smallest act of human kindness. Not everyone carries a gun because they want to kill someone, but that morning, Silas Ward carried a gun because he knew someone was coming to kill him. The news spread like wildfire. The hermit farmer on the edge of town had bought a Chinese girl and dared to bring her into a restaurant as if she were a white man. It took little more than that for the men of Copper Falls to view Silas as a thorn in the side of the road. In their eyes, he had not only disgraced the town, but had betrayed their race, their blood, and the order they were trying to maintain with their fists and their guns. Take Cod Jennings led the first group of horses after Silas, his face as red as a Highland afternoon, his mouth roaring menacingly like a bloodhound. With him were several familiar cowboys, men who had killed not for vengeance but for pride. Silas had expected this. After the rejected meal at the restaurant, after the disgusted looks and hissing behind his back, he had seen the outcome. So he didn't stay. He didn't beg. He didn't explain. He just said to men, "Let's go. Now." The old carriage rolled out of the alley behind the boarding house, carrying him, Min, and the wrath of the town behind it. The road out of Copper Falls was rough, and neither was life. Behind them, the sound of hooves and the shouts of pursuit echoed like drum beats. Min lay flat in the wagon, clutching the wooden edge, his body shaking with every jolt. Silas lashed the reins, his eyes never leaving the rough road ahead. He knew, if they caught him, there would be no court to rule. Justice in Copper Falls had long since been buried, and the so-called law was now in Blake Jennings's gun holster. The gun went off. The first bullet grazed the roof of the carriage, the second hit the rear wheel, causing it to swerve. The old horse pushed itself forward, as if it knew the lives of those behind it were on its back. Silas turned, drawing the Winchester from the wooden rack on the side of the car, a move he hadn't used in years but now meant the difference between life and death. His face twisted in smug rage. He thought Silas wouldn't dare fire. He thought an old man like Silas would have a shaky hand. He was wrong. A dry explosion rang out. Blazing E was thrown from the saddle like a sack of torn cloth. He fell to the ground, a cloud of dust flying. The horse didn't stop in time, dragging him a few feet before breaking into a run. The rest of the horses behind him stopped, not because they felt sorry for Blake, but because, for the first time, they realized the man wasn't running because he was afraid. He was fighting for what was right. Blood was spilled, and anger had transcended personal honor. This was no longer the story of a Chinese girl. This was the story of one person who dared to confront a false justice that had long since rotted, and was willing to pay the price. All guns were trained on Silas Ward, and at that moment, the sound of footsteps pounding the ground echoed, as solid and calm as the voice of God's judgment. Marshal Tucker had arrived. No one heard his horse, no one noticed him as he pushed through the dust, but now, as he stepped into the wire-like enclosure, his boots clicking on the dry ground, all eyes turned to him as if drawn by a magnet. "Well, looks like I came just in time," Tucker said, his hand absently resting on the Colt at his belt. Cord Jennings roared, his voice filled with anger and fear. "Marshal, you know this old man disgraced the town. He bought that Chinese girl in front of everyone like he was the Messiah." Blake stood by, dirt still on his cheeks from the fall, eyes red with hatred. "He kidnapped her, pretending to be a good guy, but think about it. A guy living alone, bringing a foreign girl home? What do you think he's planning on doing?" Tucker was silent, his eyes looking from person to person. He didn't look at Silas first, nor at Min, who was cowering in the car. He looked at the crowd, the people clinging to each other to justify their cruelty, and then he spoke. "His girl, as if that's legal," Cord growled. "Of course it was legal. There was an auction, there were papers, there were witnesses. Everyone in this town saw it." Marshal Tucker nodded slowly. "Yes, there is paperwork." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his shirt and waved it in the wind. "I have a copy too. But what I'm wondering is, who had the right to sell her in the first place? Who signed the transfer papers? Who proved that she was their property?" Jailed fell silent. A few of the men turned to look at each other. Garrett, the restaurant owner, spat on the ground. Blake took a step back. Frank Morrison, who had placed the first bid at the auction, smiled wryly. Who knows? The seller said they had papers from an orphanage in Utah. There is no orphanage in Utah that gives children to civilians without court protection, Tucker said, his voice now sharp as steel. I contacted the local authorities. No one has her name. No one has reported her missing. And absolutely, no one has the right to sell people in this country. Punching stepped straight at Blake, then Cord. If any of you ever bid on her, I can prosecute you on the spot. Charge, engaging in the illegal sale of a human being. No more guns drawn, no more threats. Justice does not need to be shouted. It just needs to be shown at the right moment. Silas looked up at Marshall, his eyes shining with something between gratitude and pride. The crowd dispersed one by one, without another word. They had lost, not by bullets, but by the law, which had indeed returned to its former form, a scale that did not tilt by color or power. And that day, for the first time in many years, justice did not remain silent. The desert wind blew through the ravine, carrying dust and the scent of blood that had not yet dried. The pursuers were pushed back. Blake lay behind him, his pride shattered, and those who had bid for the lives of others retreated in silence and humiliation. But in that desolate wasteland, with the late afternoon sun beating down on the rocks like fire, Silas Ward knew there was one last thing he had to do. Min remained in the trunk, her big black eyes filled with confusion. She did not cry, did not laugh, just looked at him as if trying to guess if this man would change his mind like so many others had. Because she knew, papers were chains, and no matter how gentle and protective Silas was, the title deed still said one cruel thing. She was not free. Connection was the car, reaching into the inside pocket of his old coat. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, the kind everyone in Copper Falls had seen before, a title deed, usually reserved for horses, tools, or slaves under the shadow of the law. The ink was still fresh. The scrawled words were still legible. Sold to Silas Ward, one female, of Chinese descent. He stared at the long time. The price was only $3.50, but he knew. The real price was honor, the scorn of the town, the bullets he had faced defending a man the law had silently rejected. And then, without a word, Silas held the paper high. Sound echoed between the rocks. Take. The piece of paper was torn in half. One more time. And again. Silas let the scraps of paper fly to the wind, like the ashes of a cruel system that had just been burned away, not by fire, but by the quiet courage of a man who could no longer ignore it. Min looked at the pieces of paper flying away, her eyes wide. You tore them? Her voice was as soft as a breath, in disbelief. Deeded and walked toward the car. He didn't moralize or say anything lofty. He simply said, demolished, you, not me, no one. That sentence, simple and quiet, carries more weight than 100 sentences. And in that moment, in the middle of nowhere, a human being who was considered a commodity was given his rightful place. Freedom. Not by law, not by consensus, but by reason. Justice isn't always a court case. Sometimes it's the act of one person doing the right thing, when everyone around them says it shouldn't be. Justice in the West doesn't usually come in the form of scales or judges. It comes on horseback with dust on its coat and a gun strapped to its hip. And that afternoon on the edge of the sun-scorched rocks, justice came in the name of Marshall Tucker. When Marshall raised his hand, the three riders beside him stopped. These were not men of many words, but the guns at their hips were well known in Copper Falls. They had been fired for good and had stopped the wrong man from ever making another. Bleak Jennings stood in the crack of rock, his face red, his hands still shaking from defeat, unable to believe that he, the son of Cord Jennings, who could buy the town if he wanted, would be stopped by a law enforcement officer he once thought was a puppet. Blake, Tucker said, not loudly but so clearly that the wind stopped to listen, if you and the people behind you don't turn your horses around right now, I will be forced to consider this an armed riot. And I swear to God I will have every single one of you taken to federal court. Bola looked around. No one wanted to meet his eyes. Frank Morrison had his head down, as if the ground beneath his feet had suddenly become worth looking at. A few of the men turned their horses, without waiting for further words. They had come here expecting to witness a moral punishment for an old fool and a girl who didn't belong here. But now they realized it wasn't Silas Ward who was wrong, it was them. Cord Jennings rode up, his face stony. He said nothing but pulled on Blake's horse, signaling him to back off. Marshall watched, his eyes devoid of arrogance. He had not come here to win. He had come to do what was right, something the town had long forgotten. When the group disappeared behind the rocks, Marshall turned to Silas. He saw his old friend's hands still shaking, saw Min clutching the edge of the cart, her lips pressed white. He stepped forward, put his hand on Silas's shoulder, and said softly, just enough for the two of them to hear, "You just did something that not everyone dares to do, but from now on, you won't have to do it alone." Silas did not reply. He only nodded, his eyes on Copper Falls, where justice had just returned after a long slumber. It changed, but the wind has. The whispers in the taverns will change. The kids will remember this day as the day someone stood up and wasn't shot for it. On the farm track, the evening shadows stretched across the crimson hills. The wind blew gently across the dry fields, carrying the smell of burnt grass and the silence of a land that had not forgotten violence, but was temporarily at rest. Silas Ward, with gunpowder on his coat, drove slowly through the old wooden gate, where the weeds grew tall and the neighing of horses echoed from the empty stables. Beside him, Min sat quietly, clutching his small bag as if he were clutching the remainder of his life. The farm wasn't big, nor was it pretty, but it offered something Copper Falls never had, a peace that didn't need to be bought or proven. Silas stopped the car, got out first, and held out his hand to help Min. She hesitated for a moment, then put her hand in his, no longer shaking, no longer cowering. Just a human being, placing trust in another human being, not bound by law, but by a human dignity awakened at the right moment. "You can stay as long as you like," Silas said, his eyes not on her, but on the distant fields, where the sun was setting, but would surely rise tomorrow. Min said nothing, but she nodded. And with that nod, a new life began, not as a slave, but in the slow light of freedom. Take. 6 months after the red dust of Copper Falls was stained with blood and anger, the western prairies witnessed something unprecedented in the history of the land. A small Chinese woman, once auctioned off like cattle, was now a landowner. Not in name, not by charity, but for real. Min now stands in the middle of her lush backyard, her hands muddy, but her back straight and her eyes bright. Her rows of vegetables, carrots, cabbages, cucumbers, are sold at the same stalls as the biggest farms in the area, and no one dares to look down on them anymore. Because the person who grows them is no longer the Chinese girl who is seen as a commodity, but Miss Min, a woman who works from dawn to dusk cultivating her own future. Silas still lived in the old cabin, now legally half Min's. No one forced him to, but he knew that land was only truly valuable when it liberated someone, not enslaved them. And he knew that it was never too late to do the right thing. The people in the area began to change, slowly but surely. Whispers behind his back gave way to respectful nods. Those who had avoided him began to learn to say, "Hello." A few women in town came to Min to ask him how to grow vegetables, how to keep the soil from becoming infertile. And Min, who had been saved by kindness, now used kindness to sow again. Justice perhaps never comes quickly in the West, but when it does come, it leaves its mark, not in blood, but in rich harvests. If you believe in stories where the right must fight to survive, where kindness is never weak, and where one small act can change a life, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel now. The next story may bring tears to your eyes, clench your fists, or make you want to stand up and scream at the world. Because in the wildest corners of America, justice never dies. It just waits to be awakened.